Hello, everybody, and welcome. My apologies, first of all. It does appear there's been a slight problem with our Eventbrite link today. I know some people have had difficulty getting in, so we're doing our best to resolve that. But many of you are in, and it's a real pleasure to welcome all those of you who've made it through the IT difficulties tonight into our lecture tonight, to welcome you here and to welcome our speaker, Mark Mazower. Well, my name's Emma Griffin. I'm here in my capacity as the president of the Royal Historical Society. I'm very delighted to be introducing tonight's international lecture with our speaker, Mark Mazower. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. I'd like to remind everybody that this event has subtitles, and you can switch those on or off by clicking on the CC Live Transcript button on the bottom right hand of your screen, according to your preference. For questions, we're going to use the question and answer feature at the end of the lecture. I'll remind you about that at the end when Mark has finished speaking. And a reminder too that tonight's lecture is being recorded, and we're going to make it publicly available through our website in very near future. Anybody who's present here will receive an email about that at the time. Well, tonight's speaker is Mark Mazower, and he'll be known to many of you as a frequent reviewer and commentator in the US and the UK. And of course, as well as the author of some of the most ambitious, thought-provoking and sobering histories of modern Europe. This evening, Mark joins us from New York University, where he is the Ira D. Wallach Professor of History at Columbia University. From 2018, he's also been the director of the university's Institute for Ideas and Imagination in Paris. Prior to his move to the US, he taught at Birkbeck University in London, and he has many ongoing ties with the UK, including being one of the member of the editorial board of the journal Past and Present, known to many of us, of course. Over three decades, Mark's research and publications have focused on the history of modern Greece and encompasses 19th and 20th century Europe, the rise of the international system, and historiography. His books on Greece and Eastern Europe include Inside Hitler's Greece, Salonika, City of Ghosts, and the Balkans from the end of Byzantium to the present day, which won the Wolfson Prize for History in 2001. In 2021, Mark was awarded an honorary Greek citizenship for his promotion of Greece, its long history and culture to the international general public. Subsequent books include Hitler's Europe in 2008, followed by Governing the World in 2012, and in 2018, What You Did Not Tell, a family memoir that traces Mark's Russian grandfather's contribution to Jewish socialist activism and exile to London in the 1920s. But tonight he's going to be speaking about the subject of his new book, The Greek Revolution, 1821 and the Making of Modern Europe, just recently published in the very end of 2021. Here he sets the Greek conflict with the Ottoman Turks in its European-wide context, demonstrating both the international appeal of the Greek cause and the war's legacy for nationalist movements in the shaping of Europe over the long 19th century. The title for his lecture tonight is An Eastern Question and Its History, writing about the Greek War of Independence. So welcome, Mark, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Emma, and the Royal Historical Society for your invitation to talk this evening. I do appreciate it, and I look forward especially to the discussion afterwards. It's not too much of a stretch to say that the emergence of the professional study of modern European history in the 20th century Anglo-American university was inseparable from the practice of diplomatic history. We're now familiar with the story of its expansion as a result of the post-Versailles opening up of foreign ministry archives and the involvement of historians by governments anxious to prove or disprove the view of the background to 1914 incarnated in the war guilt clause of the Treaty of Versailles in particular. When the Journal of Modern History was established in the US in the mid-1920s to provide a forum for modern Europeanists, three of the founding editors were young men with a deep knowledge of the war and its aftermath. Archibald Coolidge's protege, William Langer, the pioneering Slavicist, Robert Kerner, and Edward Mead Earle, the author of an early diplomatic treatment of Ottoman-German relations. And the subject loomed large in its pages from the very first issue. The diplomatic approach still seemed alive and well after 1945, if anything, revitalized by the abandonment of interwar idealism in international affairs. And the Second World War provided a second origins question for historians to argue about as they continued to do late into the 20th century. Yet from surprisingly early on, there came prognostications of doom, caveats and cautions about the status of diplomatic history itself. The often close connection between the diplomatic historian and officialdom, which had actually helped to lever open archives and establish government backing for the historian's work, cast a shadow over the impartiality of the results. As early as 1946, scholars of international relations were uncomfortably aware that the era of the primacy of the diplomats was waning and that new forms of power in international life might require new approaches. So Llewellyn Woodward speculated a little uncomfortably that historians might be obliged to turn from grand conferences to the proceedings of treasury officials, or still worse, the deliberations of milk marketing boards. By the 1970s, the argument was that diplomatic history ignored social forces, and social and cultural history henceforth took over history departments. The great divergence had happened earlier in France. For Brodel, of course, l'histoire événementielle had been since the war mere froth on the great waves of the medium and the longue durée. At the century's end, Charles Mayer argued that the era of territoriality itself was over, and with it, older forms of history writing that acted as if boundaries and borders and what he called the decision spaces they enclosed were the stuff of historical change. It would be beside the point for me to add my halfpenny's worth to this mountain of criticism, and I've no intention of doing so. For one thing, I believe that much of what passed in the 1920s and 30s for diplomatic history was in fact much broader in approach and quite eclectic, often in methodology. Harold Temperley's sprawling 1936, England and the Near East, for instance, ranges quite widely, if often speculatively, across questions of Ottoman internal governance and reform. However, any historian of the Balkans is bound to grapple with the Anglo-American diplomatic tradition for the simple reason that the historiography of the Eastern question was for a long time the principal, if not the only way in which historians here interested themselves in that part of the world. My own experiences can perhaps elucidate the kind of intellectual challenges and opportunities that this has thrown up. And so what I'd like to do very informally in this talk is say something about this in the context of my particular interests, and then go on to discuss how I approached the structuring and argument of the latest book I've written on the Greek War of Independence. I first began to grapple with modern Greece and its history at the start of the 1980s. At this time, two of the key questions tackled by Anglophone historians of the country were diplomatic in nature. Firstly, the background to the decision to enter the First World War on the Allied side. And second, the great power politics of the country's very central role in the early stages of the Cold War in the late 1940s. The former was scarcely surprising. The decision to enter the war in 1917 had split the country in two, a crisis known in Greece to this day as the national schism, the ethnikos dichasmos, with Republican pro-Entente Venezuelans pitted against royalists. 2 or 3 decades of constitutional instability followed. As a result, it was really only the ideological polarization between the left and its enemies in the late 1940s that reduced the passions of the dichasmos. As for the left-right split itself, this originated in the politics of the Second World War resistance struggle, but exploded into outright civil war after the Germans left. With British troops ensconced on the Acropolis in December 1944, firing into communist-dominated quarters of Athens, and later American planes napalming the slopes of Mount Gramos, the Civil War had been of a ferocity unrivaled even by the Nazi occupation, and bore witness to the very real power exerted by the great powers on this small country. Its scars were certainly visible into the 1970s when the country's politics remained firmly under the thumb of Washington. I got to know the country when some of the memories were starting to fade. The collapse of the junta and the war in Cyprus had discredited the Americans, and in 1981, the resurgent left celebrated with its first ever socialist government, which assumed power under Andreas Papandreou. In this climate, it was a historiographical commonplace that Greece occupied a position of extreme dependence upon the great power configuration of the day, and had essentially either two stances to choose from: one, compliance equals collaboration, if you wanted to think of it like that, or defiance, resistance. The far left activists of the November the 17th terrorist group, who equated the struggle, as we can now see, against the Nazis with their resistance to the CIA and capitalism in the 30 or 40 years that followed the end of the junta, in fact, spoke for a quite wide swathe of Greek public opinion. My instinct was to react against all this by searching for a topic that would allow me to explore Greece and its politics in conditions of relative autonomy from the international system. Thus, I was led for my doctorate to a subject of then almost antiquarian irrelevance, little suspecting how topical it would become 3 decades later, namely the debt default of 1931 to 32, and the moment at which a system of international political and economic control over the country collapsed. In general, what I was looking for was a way of thinking about Greece's history that did not explain everything with reference to what people called the foreign finger, to xenodactylo, or would allow space to be given to internal forces. Partly because Greece is a small country that relatively few people care about outside it, except during their summer holidays, partly because much of my early teaching was actually in an international relations department, and partly because working on Greece offered an interesting vantage point from which to consider larger European questions, I also became something of a general Europeanist. And this, after the war in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, led me, as many others, back into the history of international politics. I was not coming to this from a background in diplomatic history, obviously, but rather from an interest in how ideas of order circulated and formed new international regimes. The end of the Cold War and the revival of interest in the UN led me to seek a way of thinking about relations between states that took account of ideas, norms, and international organizations themselves. Watching the UN, not to mention human rights organizations, fumble the question of minority rights in former Yugoslavia, raised the question of the UN's historical relationship to the League of Nations and the origins of the League's own rights regime. At that time, there was next to nothing on this of any historical value. Watching the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 raised the question of how, in pure power terms, one could explain the history of the American relationship with international organizations at all. UN historians, a handful, had not devoted much attention to the problem of why a superpower should have supported the creation of the organization. As for US Cold War historians, the subject of the UN was evidently regarded by them as trivial and unworthy of serious discussion. As I was working on these issues, I found myself watching the era of globalization sputter to an end and the financial crisis of 2009 to 10 unfold. Seeing the surveillance of Greece's economy by the infamous Troika after 2010 raised an even more fundamental question. What did national sovereignty actually mean? This question was lurking for me in the history of the international system, which, as I had come to understand it, was a history that conjoined the rise of the nation state as a European and then global norm, and the history of international cooperation as a story of organized interactions among states. Why then the nation state, and to what end? It was this last question that pushed me back 200 years to 1821, and the Greeks once again, to explore what sovereignty had meant to the protagonists at the time, and to ask how and why a more or less independent nation state had come into being. My inquiry into 1821 has proceeded under a double sign. On the one hand, the desire to explore the local roots of the uprising and the local and regional factors that shaped its outcome. And on the other, the quest to see this struggle as a foundational chapter in a larger story about the transformation of the international system itself after the Napoleonic Wars. It was Leonard Woolf, writing in 1916 in his treatise on international government, who had hailed the conference system that had led to Greece's international recognition as the first step towards a new means of securing world peace. Whether or not that was true, it was clear that the international dimension to the Greek War of Independence was of some significance. Its conventional ending, after all, was provided by the process of international recognition of Greece, a chapter in a larger diplomatic history of the Eastern question, and indeed for some, the moment that marked the onset of Ottoman decline. Methodologically, however, the challenge of combining these two perspectives, the Greek nationalist and the international diplomatic, was anything but straightforward, for the two historiographies scarcely acknowledged one another's existence. The prevailing nationalist Greek historiography, as it had evolved over decades, was customarily told as a story of ethnic heroism, with God on the side of the Greeks, who really needed the great powers. Insofar as they figured, it was either as Machiavellian meddlers trying to divert the cause of freedom for their own selfish interests, or alternatively, it was as junior partners, willing volunteers. The story of Philhellenism was often written under this sign, ancillary to the great struggles of the Greeks on land and sea. This weighting was reversed by historians of the Eastern question, for whom, with post-Victorian civilizational disdain, the Greeks scarcely mattered at all. Take Charles Crawley, for example, the author of the first scholarly treatment of the Greek War of Independence in 1930. I've thought it not irrelevant, he begins urbanely, to relieve a mainly diplomatic narrative by a few glimpses of the turbulent stream of Greek politics and guerrilla warfare. His point of view throughout, he continues, quote, remains in London in an attempt to understand the problem of British policy. This gets it well. The Eastern question, the very formulation, was in its essence a problem of management, a great power problem. Yet a little reflection suffices to show the inadequacy of each historical framing. It is not only that the Greek uprising was regarded at the time as part of a larger set of revolutions and insurrections that roiled Southern Europe and Southern America between 1818 and the 1820s. Worse still, from the perspective of an older Greek nationalist mindset, the sporadic acts of heroism that make up the stuff of the epic struggle cannot easily be translated into a winning strategy. The courageous Brulatier Canaris, later a 7-time prime minister of the country, destroyed much larger Ottoman vessels on several very remarkable occasions. But by 1826, the Greeks had lost control of the seas and reverted to piracy. Perhaps the best known warrior, Theodoroscotronis, a former Cleft, won his greatest renown in 1821, first starving out the Ottomans from the provincial capital of Tripolitsa, and then the following summer destroying a much larger Ottoman army in the passes south of Corinth. By 1827, Kolokotronis was helpless, and most of his followers had abandoned him. The other great hero, Karaskakis, had died on the battlefield outside Athens, unable to break the Ottoman siege of the town. There is simply no plausible account of these years that does not place the Battle of Navarino in the autumn of 1827 and its entirely unexpected outcome, the destruction of the Ottoman fleet, at the heart of any explanation of how an independent Greece came into existence. As for the diplomatic history of the Eastern question, it can answer the question of how diplomats handled the matter of Greece's independence, but it has much greater difficulty in explaining why they had to handle it at all, without reference to the events and actors on the ground in southeastern Europe. In short, it's hard to tell a story of what happened in London, Paris, and St. Petersburg that does not also include the story of Tripolitsa, Chios, and Istanbul. That is as attentive to the supply problems in the mountains of Rumeli as it is to protocol in Vienna. Let me elaborate. The conventional account of the Greek War of 1821 begins with the formation of a secret society, the so-called Friendly Society, in Odessa in 1814 to 15. And right from the start, we're in a kind of dialogic relationship. Greek activists on the one hand, European statecraft on the other. The society was formed by men angry that the diplomats in Vienna had refused to consider the plight of the Balkan Christians of the Ottoman Empire. It was essentially a subversive organization designed to engineer a foreign Christian intervention in the Ottoman lands. And as such, it was regarded with immense suspicion by the powers themselves. Much debate has gone on over the past half century about the nature of the Metanikian peace of 1815, most recently and thoughtfully in Stella Gerefis' Conquering Peace. Yet, however one characterizes the goals and the ideological tenor of the Restoration, one thing is clear. Its entire premise was that revolt against duly constituted monarchical authority was insupportable. Thus, the leaders of the Filiki Eteria were taking on the united opposition of the great powers, and they knew it. their task was nothing less than to subvert the principles established at Vienna. And this is why they assured their own new recruits that the Tsar himself was secretly supportive of the Greeks. It wasn't true, but they realized that without this assurance, no one would believe that a small underground movement had any hope of success in defying the will of Europe and overthrowing Ottoman rule. If the Greeks did not believe in their own capabilities, neither did the European powers. When news reached Laibach, where the powers were meeting, that the Greeks under Alexandros Ypsilantis had crossed the River Pruth into Ottoman Moldavia to launch their long-awaited campaign, they declared their opposition and confidently expected the expedition to be quickly crushed, as indeed it was. Were we to stop the clock in the summer of 1821 and confine our view to the Danubian principalities, we would see the Greek uprising as just another in the string of liberal failures that began in Palermo and Piedmont and ended later in Spain. But in a complex chain of events that I describe in the book, the revolutionaries successfully stirred up the Peloponnese and parts of Roumelia as well, benefiting from the ongoing turmoil created by the last stand of Ali Pasha of Yanina. And by the time Ali was defeated, the Ottomans had lost control of the Morea. In short, it was the Sultan's failure to crush the Greeks that really created the first dilemma for the great powers. And it's easy to overlook just how remarkable and unexpected this failure was. Across the Ottoman world, we have evidence from as far afield as North Africa. People confidently expected the Greek revolt to be brought to a swift end and were astonished when it wasn't. The failure of the Ottoman campaigns in the Peloponnese against the rebels, not only in 1821, but also the following year, transformed the struggle and its diplomatic implications, signaling that those first defeats had not been an isolated misfortune, but were symptoms of a deeper and more systemic collapse of imperial power. Ottoman rule consolidated itself elsewhere. In Asia Minor, it was never seriously challenged. In Macedonia and Thessaly, Crete and the Dodecanese Islands, it recovered fairly fast. But in the Peloponnese, a standoff emerged between the Greeks, predominant almost everywhere on land, and the Ottomans clinging to a few Venetian castles along the coastline. For the Greeks, not to be defeated was a kind of victory. Yet it was not in itself enough to resolve the conflict. And for them, the fundamental challenge remained as it had been, to subvert the principles of the Restoration and bring the great powers round to support their cause. And it is here, in the analysis of how this happened, that the historian is obliged to bring the two stories, the Greek and the international, into conversation with one another. Let us at this point note an important asymmetry in Greece's relations then and later, but especially then, with the great powers. As remains the case today, great powers tend to see small countries as management issues. Afghanistan, Iraq, the contemporary cases mirror the Greek situation. The power overload is offset and often undermined by a knowledge deficit. How much real expertise was there in Britain or the US on Afghanistan and Iraq in 2001 or 3? How much knowledge of the Greeks in Western Europe in 1821? Very little is the answer in every case. From the side of the great powers, ignorance and condescension, reflecting not merely cultural prejudices, but often gaps, only later appreciated in any real knowledge of the countries and their societies at their mercy. Small countries, on the other hand, tend to be somewhat more knowledgeable about the larger ones because they have to be. Knowledgeable enough in any case to be able to figure out what buttons to press and how to get heard. To put it less starkly, perhaps, in these encounters, what assume crucial importance are vectors of knowledge, the channels by which each side comes to understand the other, and not merely to understand them, but to understand how to bend them to their will. The Greeks, some of them, understood several things about the powers. They appreciated in the first place that while they knew next to nothing about the realities of their lives, they were obsessed by classical learning and by ancient Greece. They played on this cultural capital unabashedly. Mavromichalis Bey, the first military leader of the Greeks in the Peloponnese, no sooner took over Ottoman Kalamata than his friendly society advisors, young men schooled abroad in European universities, thoroughly conversant with European political theory and Enlightenment ideas, drafted, printed, and sent off a proclamation that informed Europe that the ancient Spartans had risen. One of the more sadistic of the Greek military chieftains, Odysseus Androutsos, managed to persuade the Indian army officer and devoted Benthamite Leicester Stanhope that he was ruling over the Athenians like some benign classical magistrate. In fact, he was dismembering his opponents and chucking their limbs off from the Acropolis. Such proclamations and such acts were by themselves of little importance. They changed no hearts in European chancelleries, but they indicated a relatively sophisticated understanding about the European imagination and an appreciation that in the ancient Greeks, the insurgents had cultural capital that, say, the Serbs lacked. And cultural capital mattered because these political advisors to the revolution were increasingly gambling on European public opinion to turn the statesmen around. The second thing some of the Greeks understood was European political theory and its importance in making their struggle widely legible and even perhaps in some way thus legitimizing it. The key figure here is that remarkably interesting confidant of the Shelleys, Prince Alexandros Mavrocordatos. As we know from an excellent study of him by Yorgos Theodoridis, Mavrocordatos was a polymath with governing experience, an exceptional man who kept his Swiss bookseller busy while remaining in touch with prominent European diplomats, many of whom he'd known intimately from his time in service as minister in the Wallachian government. Shortly before deciding to leave Pisa for Greece in 1821, Mavrocordatos composed a remarkable memorandum that he intended to be read by Gentz and Metternich. Entitled Coup d'œil sur la Turquie, it is an analysis surely unique of the shortcomings of the Ottoman imperial administration and of the reasons why the European powers should support the Greeks. Authored by a man who was both a high-ranking former Ottoman official and a keen student of European politics and history. Mavrocordatos clearly believed before he set out for Greece, indeed before the Greek rising took place, that the success of the cause depended upon European support and that gaining this was essential. The process was far more complex and arduous than he can have imagined in Pisa. Nevertheless, it remained the mission he set himself, and it shaped his very influential role in the uprising itself. This is not the place to go into the skill with which Mavrocordatos, with little money and few soldiers to back him and no regional power base, brilliantly inserted himself into the revolution. What should be stressed is what he did once he was there, which was to craft an entirely new form of politics. Forms of representative governance were not in fact known to the Greeks of the Ottoman Morea, but they were usually of local or at most regional significance. Like his mentor, Archbishop Ignatius, another very worldly Greek in exile, Mavrocordatos hammered away to anyone who would listen at one thing: national administration, ethniki diikisi. The first thing he did when he arrived in Messaloniki was to set up, at least formally, a representative regional government. The next thing was to organize the formation of a national government, complete with provisional constitution and civil service. He himself became its first president in early 1822. Its achievements were few. Its power was almost non-existent in that first year, especially as the regional assemblies continued to exist and held the real authority in areas under their control. What the 1822 provisional constitution really meant in practice is thus an open question, and that has led many observers, both Greek and foreign, then and now, to dismiss it as a house of cards, a con trick, a government that was nothing but a government on paper. But that missed the point, I think. Mavrocordatos understood that the European diplomacy could not be easily persuaded to back the Greeks, and that to do that, he had to make them see that the Greek cause was legitimate. And this would require a form of revolutionary government that could articulate principles Europeans understood. The Greeks had to be turned in the European imagination from dangerous and subversive radicals rising against their legitimate sovereign to a Christian people claiming their natural rights and liberties from a tyrannical despot. And thus it was Greeks such as Mavrocordatos, and not so far from him, the Tsar's former foreign minister, another Greek, Kapodistrias, and his advisor Sturza, who engineered the redefinition of the Greek uprising as a people struggle against illegitimate rule. It took them 4 or 5 years to manage this, but it was an achievement. They were helped surely by the Sultan's own indifference to European political norms. This cost him dear. Metternich, who prided himself on his cold-blooded realism, had boasted on one occasion that a few 100,000 deaths in the Ottoman lands meant nothing in European terms. Mavrocordatos and others wagered he was wrong, and they turned out to be right. Not immediately, to be sure. European outrage flared up in the spring and summer of 1821, especially after news came in of the horrible murder of the Patriarch Gregorius V in Constantinople, but then it died away again. The Russian ambassador eventually quit the Ottoman capital, but war was averted between the Ottomans and the Russians. And the same thing happened the following year. Europe was outraged by the massacres on Chios in the spring of 1822, but did nothing that altered the Holy Alliance's refusal to get involved. Yet in establishing a Greek revolutionary government, Mavrocordatos and the others created a potential interlocutor for Europe, and by hanging on and avoiding defeat, they won the time for news of Ottoman violence to work its effect on European public opinion. Between Byron's death in 1824 and the fall of Missolonghi in 1826, the European public was primed for outrage. Which brings me to the importance of public opinion as a new factor in international life and the cultural forces that underpinned it. Lucien Freire, in a recent study of Russia's involvement in Greek affairs, has demonstrated that Tsarist diplomacy can only be understood in conjunction with shifts in Russian public attitudes. That there was enormous enthusiasm from the start, especially in southern Russia, for the idea of another war with the Turks to defend orthodoxy, so that the Tsar faced pressures to intervene that, say, the Habsburgs and Metternich did not. These pressures were resisted for several years, but they were real. Indeed, if there was one factor internationally that has not been given its due in the very Anglophone historiography of the Eastern question, it is surely Russia and the pressure it continuously exerted on the Ottoman Empire before it did launch the long anticipated war against the Sultan in 1828. Of all the powers convened at Vienna and committed to the post-Napoleonic peace, Britain was the most ambivalent. It held aloof from the Holy Alliance, and it did not let the outbreak of revolution in Greece dissuade it from adopting a very different policy towards South America than any other European power. Yet in the case of British policy, perhaps even more than in the Russian case, diplomacy, even in the hands of a master practitioner like George Canning, could not be shaped in isolation from larger social forces. Canning himself was acutely aware of the power of the press and public opinion. What one British Philhellene hailed in 1823 as, quote, the empire of opinion, was something he was acutely conscious of. He noted at one point that the European war of the future would likely be one, quote, not of armies, but of opinions. And he likened the handling of British foreign policy as being the position of someone forced to make his way down a raging torrent, sometimes compelled to jump one way across the stream, sometimes the other. This graphically illustrated the subordinate role of the statesman in the face of something close to a force of nature. We can recognize at least three distinct, if conjoined, non-diplomatic forces that bore upon Canning's decisions in the Greek case. The first was the lobby in the shape of the London Greek Committee, a coalition, mostly Whig and radical and driven by Benthamites like John Bowery. It emerged from the wreckage of the experiment in Spain to proselytize for the Greek cause through pamphleteering, speechifying, and subscription work. It brought taverns such as the Crown and Anchor in the Strand into the foreign policy debate. The Tory press was outraged. Quote, this is the affair of state, not of the pothouse. But the time had passed when the two could be easily separated. Closely connected with the taverns and the radicals was the very new financial role of the City of London, its investors. The Greeks had been contemplating the financing of the revolution from the outset, and in fact before it, and they were well informed about the difficulties of raising capital on the continent in the face of Habsburg disapproval, because they had already tried this. Their connections with London were actually pretty weak. Anti-British prejudice amongst the Greeks was high, because the chief association they had with the British was through their quasi-colonial rule in the Ionian Islands. Nevertheless, reaching out to the British was a priority for the Mavrocordatos faction in particular, and the first agent sent out to London, Andreas Louriotis, was a member of his inner circle. Once contact had been established, Mavrocordatos took pains to keep it in his hands, using the Ionian Islands as a staging post for news and conversations. The conversations that took place in London and Greece in 1823 that preceded the first loan were in a way more important than the fruits of the loan themselves. The latter had a great impact upon the rise and fall of factions among the revolutionaries and kept alive the prospect of that group most attuned to international assistance. But English gold did nothing in military terms to alter the course of the fighting against the Sultan, which the Greeks continued to lose. On the other hand, the conversations themselves effectively established the Greeks as a quasi-diplomatic interlocutor. It would be good to know more about some of the secret conversations that took place at this time, notably those brokered on board HMS Cambrian by one of the most important, if understudied, figures in this whole story, the British naval captain Gawain Hamilton, who spent the entire period of the war at sea with the Levant Squadron and was trusted by the Greeks and a source of decisive advice for them on occasions. It is clear that through Hamilton and others, the insurgents were able to exploit a back channel to Whitehall that was the precondition for Canning's gradual shift towards a peacemaking mode and his extraordinary rapprochement with Russia and the Tsar. It was only the possibility that the Greeks might actually turn from Russia to Britain for help that induced the Tsar in 1825, followed shortly after his death by his successor Nicholas, to respond to Canning's overture and to embark on the secret diplomacy that ended up scuppering the Holy Alliance and creating the basis of the coalition behind victory at Navarino. Yet even the loans and the English connection these indicated would likely not have sufficed to bring the great powers into the conflict on the Greek side had it not been for something else entirely unexpected: the Sultan's decision to turn to his Egyptian vassal Mehmet Ali to help him end the revolt. The Egyptian expedition led by Mehmet's son Ibrahim landed in the Morea in early 1825 and swept all before it. The Greeks scarcely held on. At Messolongi in the spring of 1826, a coalition of Egyptian and Ottoman forces worked together as never before to all but wipe out Greek resistance north of the Gulf of Corinth. It looked to be only a matter of time before the uprising was crushed in the Peloponnese as well, in 1827 or at latest the following year. As reports reached Europe of the mass enslavement of the Greeks, which were true, along with rumors that apparently originated in Russia and were not true, that there was a deliberate Ottoman policy of de-Christianizing the Peloponnese, deporting its entire population and replacing it with Muslims, Philhellenism in Europe revived and intensified across party lines. This was most visible in France, where the Bourbons' pro-Egyptian policy made them vulnerable to accusations of selling out a Christian people. It was in France, above all, that the Greek cause swelled the sails of Romanticism and mobilized a sufficiently broad swathe of public opinion, reaching into the Orleanist aristocracy, forcing the government to abandon Metternich and join the new activist and interventionist Anglo-Russian coalition. This coalition was motivated by the desire to end the fighting in the Levant more than it was by a desire to underwrite Greek independence. And when the Battle of Navarino turned out unexpectedly to have opened a path to the latter, the hesitations and second thoughts in official circles were evident. Even the Russian court appears some years later to have regretted the intervention, but by then it was too late. Let me conclude. What an older diplomatic history got wrong was that it assumed a kind of control over events that in fact the diplomats did not possess. And it wrote off the extent to which they were reactive, reacting to military achievements on the ground, to public outrage, to lobbying. The very novelty of the post-Napoleonic conjuncture, the eruption of mass politics in various forms into statecraft, was thus missed. What the older focus on the achievements of the Greek people missed was the protagonists' acute awareness of forming part of an international milieu, their memories of earlier conflicts, the Russo-Turkish War of 1769 to 70, the Napoleonic Wars. The result, I think, is that in both cases, what we end up lacking is a sense of the sheer unexpectedness of the outcome of the revolution of 1821. Ottoman decline was not taken for granted in 1821, but by 1830, in the face of the success not only of the Greeks, but much more consequentially of the Egyptians, it had become a quite new factor in European diplomacy. The international recognition of Greek independence was regarded at first not as the beginning of a brave new world, but rather as an unfortunate turn of events that would need to be managed by the great powers for the sake of the peace. And managed it was. If Greece was a laboratory, it was for forms of conditional sovereignty, financial and diplomatic, that were its real legacy. The Greeks were obliged to accept a king imposed from outside. They were obliged to witness the enormous influence wielded by the ambassadors of the three protecting powers. They were excluded from the major decisions at the diplomatic congresses that followed. Yet the powers had not had things their own way either, and they would not in future either. Thank you very much.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. That was an absolutely fascinating lecture, and I think it's given us a lot to think about and a lot to ponder. We're going to take a pause for 5 minutes so Mark can catch his breath and get a glass of water, but we've got another half hour to run, and we'd love to receive questions from you that I will be putting to Mark. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Just wait for Mark to join us. Brilliant. Right, so I do see that a few of you have had difficulty putting things into the Q&A, and some people are posting into the chat, so I'll do my best to keep an eye on both sets of questions wherever they come in. But let us get started. Mark, questions are definitely coming in response to that fascinating paper that you gave us. I'm going to start with Anne Dayton. She writes, many thanks. I wonder if you could elaborate on the archival sources that you deployed, especially the Greek ones, and their utility. How much did you have to rely on private papers and also on the archives of at least some of the great powers, plus any reflections on how Greece has managed to support and bolster itself as a state by maintaining its archival base over the 20th century? That is a truly fascinating question, and I put that to you, Mark.
Well, I could talk all day about this. I'll try not to. I think the first thing to say about the sources is that they're voluminous. And that's for a couple of reasons. And I'm talking about the Greek sources, even before we get to the foreign ministries of the other powers. One is that it's just staggering how much paper was being carried across the mountains of Rumeli and the Morea the whole time. These guys were up there in the hills, surrounded by 2 or 3 young men, usually from their village or their milieu, who had at least some years of schooling with the local priest and knew how to write more or less politely. And so they were just sending letters off to each other. This was an oral society with a very high rate of illiteracy, and yet the sheer volume of correspondence is staggering. And immediately after the war was over, the war went on in print. That is to say, the war between the Greeks. And Kolokotronis' son puts out some immense volume of the correspondence of his dad. And everybody else is doing the same thing. And when they're not doing it, then some worthy mayor, the mayor of Hydra in the 1920s, rescues the files of Hydra. We have a huge number of volumes of the archives of Hydra. They're incredibly interesting. So there's a massive amount that was actually published in the 19th century or in the early 20th century. And then there's even more in the archives. It's an impossible amount. I was saved by COVID because I couldn't go to the archives. And so I had to rely on whatever I had or what had been digitized. And Google has digitized vast quantities of the 19th century volumes. So the material on the Greek side is immense. The Greek Parliament produced volumes of what you might call the official documentation of the provisional governments. But as I implied in my talk, the trouble was that historians made too much use of that, because really a lot of that was fairly useless paper. It didn't really mean very much, except that it existed. But there is a lot of very meaningful correspondence. One of the interesting problems that it raises is the language that it's written in, because it was written in a very polite and courteous and implausible Greek. And it's only rarely that you get a sense of how these guys actually talk to each other, which I can assure you was not very polite. And, you know, they had a rich, earthy, expletive-laden vocabulary, and it doesn't come through on paper very much. although we do have one document where Kolokotronis scrawls in the margin of a letter to Karaskakis some rude comment about how he looks. And then for the first time you hear them. But there's a massive amount, and there's a massive amount in the diplomatic archives. The Greek state ignored a lot of this for a very long time. In fact, the great collections were made by a private individual who is later appointed the first head of the archives when they're set up by Venizelos. And he rescues a valuable archive from dumps in Athens in the early years of the 20th century. So the Greek state has taken a while to catch up. Now, a lot of this is digitized. There's an absolutely spectacularly useful digital archive of 1821 that came up this year. That is very, very rich. So we're wading in archives. It's fantastic stuff.
That is fascinating that they were quite slow to start curating this archive, as it is now such a fundamental part of building a national story. But I mean, I guess it's just a really early example of 19th century nationalism as well. So
I think part of the problem was that afterwards, all these different chieftains continued their wartime squabbles with each other, and everybody else was fairly sick of it. So they didn't really want to devote resources to it.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, let's move on. John Dunbarbian has asked, could Dr. Mazower say a little more about the comparison between Greece and Serbia and the relative speed with which the two political identities expanded into their ethnically similar but unliberated neighbouring areas?
Well, there are many commonalities, most notably religion, and there were some fairly close ties at the time between the Greek insurgents and the Serbs. And of course, the Greeks were inspired by the Serbs, who had already begun to attempt to rise up against the Ottomans with partial success. I think what strikes me about, they did, however, occupy very different positions in the Ottoman Empire. Because Greek was the language of the Patriarchate, and because of the class of Ottoman Greek notables known as the Phanariots, who occupied ruling princely ministerial positions in the Ottoman court, where they had responsibility largely for the loyalty of the Orthodox subjects, any ambitious, upwardly mobile young Orthodox Christian would at some point learn Greek and become a Greek. Whereas Serbian was, well, I don't want to incur the wrath of Serb nationalists, but let's put it this way, the socioeconomic composition of the Serb society was very different, and it was built around pig farming. And so they had far fewer resources at their disposal. As far as I know, somebody like a Mavrocordatos or an Ignatius, it would be very difficult for Serb society to produce such figures. They existed in Hungary to a certain extent. Hungary was their bastion. And yes, the questioner, of course, who knows this very well, is right that both of them have very powerful irredentist movements once they've forged some degree of independence. And work hard within the confines of the great power system of the time to maneuver to expand. So without going into more details, there are a lot of similarities between the two from the point of view of irredentism, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, I'll move on to Alessandro De Mio. And I think this question follows on very nicely. He says, good evening, thank you for, oops, everything's jumping around, for a very interesting seminar. Had a question, was the war that brought Greece to independence also caused by social tensions similar to those that occurred in other areas of the Ottoman Empire, such as Syria, which had been the scene of revolts since the 17th century?
Well, the question of causes and origins is obviously one that the historians have been grappling with from the start. I think it's fair to say that the nationalist historiography just regarded this as a question of the desire for freedom, a desire to be released from tyranny, saw the subordinate position of the Greeks in the empire, as of all Christians, as a fundamental cause. When a Marxist historiography emerged in Greece after the First World War on this subject, of course, it took a different view. And the view was that you had to search for the causes in changes in material conditions and the rise of a Greek bourgeoisie associated with the boom in the wheat trade and the Russian expansion southward to the Black Sea from the late 18th century onwards. And so they adopted a much more materialist explanation, and they pointed to the very prominent role of merchants and sea captains in what happened. I think that what strikes me that was left out of a lot of this was, let's just call it the force of events. There were actually many people in the Peloponnese and in Rumeli who didn't rise up immediately, who were very, very doubtful, not mostly because they were having a great time under the Ottomans, although some of them were doing very well, but because they were terrified of the consequences, and they remembered the failed uprising of 1770, which had been catastrophic. The Ottomans intervene in a way that changes the balance of terror, because they start arresting the notables of the Peloponnese. And at that point, the notables of the Peloponnese, who are the natural leaders of the society of the Peloponnese, find that the equation changes, and it's now safer for them to line up behind the uprising than to stay at home and wait to be held as hostages, taken as hostages by the Ottomans. So my own feeling is that although there were some very important material consequences in the decades behind, ultimately the social explanation of 1821 is lacking. And there are some contingent factors on the ground that have to be taken into account. It's a very interesting question.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on to Alexander Morrison. Again, everything's jumping around, there we go. He says, thank you for a fascinating lecture, Professor Mazower. How do you think diplomatic history can best escape the trap of excessive focus on great powers as opposed to smaller states or even non-state actors? I think one reason why the subdiscipline often neglects these is linguistic. French and German are the traditional tools for European diplomatic historians. Greek, Ottoman, Turkish, Serbo-Croat, or Romanian are not, and the complexity is still greater if one looks beyond Europe. Is greater collaboration the answer?
Well, I suppose part of what I'm saying is I don't know if it's really tenable any longer to be a diplomatic historian and to call yourself a diplomatic historian, to pretend the other stuff doesn't matter, whatever period you're dealing with. I mean, that was fine if you were Harold Temperley, or if you were somebody who had been hanging out at a real life Paris peace conference and who was familiar with conference diplomacy and who was in a world where conference diplomacy mattered. You could kind of say to yourself, that's the stuff of history. Well, it isn't any longer, and arguably it wasn't even then, but you could be forgiven for thinking so. I do think that it has a momentum of its own, and there is obviously an ease that you can go into the National Archives and you plow your way through the files of the British Foreign Office, and a kind of narrative, you can construct a narrative without too much difficulty. And I think the language question is yes, exactly. You don't need to know a great many languages. You don't think about the cultural position of the diplomats themselves. I'm also struck at how easy it is just to stick to 3 or 4 big archives of the big powers and say that's it. Some of the most consequential and insightful analysis of what was happening I found in the Neapolitan archives, or rather in the published papers of Neapolitan diplomats, which was not an art. I'm still desperate to go and rummage around in there, because I think you get such an interesting view of what was going on. So I think even on its own terms, it's important to be kind of expansive in your definition of where you go and what you look for.
Thanks very much. Okay, so from Eric Goldstein, how far did Greece's geostrategic importance in the maritime age cause great power interest in other parts of the Balkans, e.g. Serbia, the Principalities, did not attract such broad-based attention? How important were Greek diaspora populations in effectively promoting the Greek cause?
Well, the Greek diaspora populations, I think, if I was going to hazard a generalization outside Russia, were not terribly important. They didn't have much weight in England. Actually, in France, the diaspora populations were split because a lot of Greeks were doing business with the Egyptians and the Ottomans, and they were on the fence about whether independence was a good thing. I think the maritime aspect of this is really critical. The British were getting pretty pissed off by 1826 at the piracy, actually mostly the fault of the Greeks in the Eastern Mediterranean, and they could see that the Ottomans were incapable of bringing this to an end. And in fact, so that was one of the principal reasons for their intervention, and the extermination of piracy in the Aegean is one of the immediate goals of the Allied fleet as soon as they have finished in Navarino. And they threaten the Greeks that they'll destroy their fleet if they don't do more to end piracy. So allowing maritime commerce to resume, restoring stability to the seas, I think that was a distinguishing feature.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. I haven't got a full name here. Finiki says, do you think this conditional sovereignty, in quotation marks, do you see this as being a continuous parameter throughout modern Greek history, or do you find this too deterministic a view?
Well, I think that it is interesting to think about Greece as a kind of model that the French and the British can then apply when the Ottoman Empire disintegrates in the First World War to the rest of the Middle East. That is to say, a model in which you appear to be on the side of the nationalist populations, you give people their independence, but then you create a structure in which you retain your influence in the spheres that matter. The British did this through monarchy. So they set up in the Middle East and they set up in the Gulf, where it still exists, it doesn't work that way now, a monarchy that will listen to the British ambassador in foreign affairs. The French do it through republics, which is kind of trickier and doesn't work so well. So I think of Greece and the conditional sovereignty of Greece as a model for that. And I think the Greeks have always lived, if not with conditional sovereignty, because I wouldn't say, I mean, what you have today in the EU is not conditional sovereignty in the same sense. Membership of the EU is something willed, but it is a recognition that there is a wisdom to the experience of a small country that a big country like Britain or the US, big in power political terms, has to come to terms with later, which is actually you don't have total autonomy. And therefore, if you can choose your fate, which essentially the Greeks did by joining the European Union, you replace one kind of conditional sovereignty for another. So I think the dilemma is pretty much always there.
Thank you so much. Okay, so moving on, Jacob Young we've got here. Thank you very much for the interesting lecture. Could you expand a little bit more on the role of the formation of European public opinion, Philhellenic, that is played in the diplomatic context? Did this pressure the great powers to take a more active stance in the conflict?
That's a very interesting question, and I think the history of Philhellenism is fairly complicated. It was much studied in the 1970s, especially during the time of the Colonel's Junta, when lots of people were writing about the last time Europeans and Americans came to the aid of Greek liberals, and they told the story of the Philhellenes of the 1820s in that light. I think that there are waves, there are phases in the 1820s, and it's important not to confuse them. I don't think in 1821 and 1822, in 1821 there was a kind of, to 22, there was a radical Philhellenism, mostly young men, many of them students, some of them veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, who go charging off to fight. It had no impact on the policies of their government. In fact, the governments were glad to see them go. And then it petered out for various reasons, partly because when there are volunteers who land in Kalamata and ask where the Spartan assembly is. They've taken all this at face value, you see. And then they're disappointed and disillusioned that modern Greeks are not the ancient Greeks. They can't tell them apart from Turks. So there is a disillusionment in 1822, and it fades away. And then in 1823 and 24, there's radical Philhellenism in England. That's again a minority fashion. But I think something happens with Byron's death. the Greeks are quite savvy about Byron. Archbishop Ignatius, who is a very distinguished Ottoman cleric, who is Mavrocordatos's mentor, says to the Greeks when he learns that Byron is going, he's an extremely well-connected guy. He said, be very careful to treat Byron well. He says, he can't do us much good, but he can do us a lot of harm. And that was essentially their view, although I think Byron was an impressive figure in what he did. But Byron's death is immediately exploited by the Greeks to do a lot of good and to transform British opinion. And it has that effect. Byron's death seemed to me one of those events that was genuinely pan-European in its impact. Everybody is talking about it. Everybody's heard about it. And so in that kind of way, yes, you can see the formation of a public opinion.
Fantastic, thank you so much. I'm flipping over to the chat. There's a question from Joe Innes here, who writes, my question is, do leaders who want to talk to international audiences have to worry about how their messages will be received locally, or can they segment their audiences? Presumably not if the communication is, for example, the Constitution. She also says, are there problems with addressing international and domestic audiences at once? And how did people deal with those?
Sorry, can you say that again? I'm not sure I followed it.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting question. And it's about how players in the Greek Revolution spoke to different audiences at the same time. So are they speaking to the international audience? Are they speaking to Greece? Can they segment up those audiences? How do they get around this difficulty that they need to appeal to more than one audience at once? Have I made that clear?
Yes, I see. Well, of course, there's no simultaneity. Messages are taking weeks, if not months, to reach. Messages from Greece are taking weeks, if not months, to reach London or to reach Paris. And so they can craft quite carefully what they say in those different milieux. And so I don't think there is a lot of overlap. What Mavrocordatos says internally in Greece, or what Kolokotronis says, is going to be different from what they might say to the diplomats. The exceptions are people like this interesting naval captain, Hamilton, with whom they will converse, knowing that that might reach the British authorities. So I think on the whole, they're very canny about crafting specific messages for the European public.
That's really interesting. And I actually, when I read that question the first time, I thought she was asking about how you speak to different audiences. And I just wonder if you could say a little bit about that, how you speak to different European audiences, and whether you need to, or you find it helpful to talk about these things in different ways, to say a Greek audience to an international audience such as we have today.
Well, that problem was very acute in the case of this subject, because it was a subject on which every Greek has an opinion because they've had it rammed down their throat at school. And so I was very conscious of intervening in something very much the property of Greeks, and at the same time telling a story that most people in Europe know absolutely nothing about. So you're sort of stretched much more than usual. I mean, writing about Nazis is easy because everybody sort of has some vague view of them. If you write about the origins of 1821, the first thing you have to do is explain where Jassy is. Nobody has a clue where it is now, let alone where it was then. And so it was very, very challenging to find a mode of expression that would be interesting both to a British or an American audience and to a Greek audience. That was difficult.
Yeah, that is really fascinating, going from the the absolute dearth of knowledge and the surfeit of knowledge all in the one topic is really quite unusual, isn't it, for us to be dealing with. And another question, I'm afraid I can't read the full name when they come up in the chat, but it's Joachim somebody or other. Historians' impact on world history is deeply needed at the moment with regard to the foreshadowing war in Ukraine. Has anything changed in your opinion with regard to diplomacy and the avoidance of war?
Has anything changed as a result of what historians do? No, I don't think so, but probably for the best, really. No, I don't think I have very much to say to that, except the obvious point that diplomacy was at the heart of international affairs through the 19th century, and it's treated by American administrations in particular as a kind of donor sport these days, and that's interesting and worrying. There is an assumption that the old great issues of war and peace don't really have to involve diplomats, and perhaps are not that important anymore, which seems a bit of a mistake to me.
Yeah, thank you. Another question from the chat. Again, I can't read the full name. Bulent H. Kazara, I think it may be a longer name than that. But anyway, they write, what experience do you have from Ottoman and Turkish archives? Does your evidence come from the Greek side? What evidence do you have on the kind of alternative set of archives that might be coming out of Ottoman and Turkish writers?
That's an excellent question. Maybe that's the most important question. I mean, the first thing is to say I don't read Ottoman Turkish. I don't speak Turkish. One of the things that was very clear to me was that this story has been told by the Greek historians as though the Ottoman Turks scarcely existed. They weren't interested in their strategy. They weren't interested in their outlook. And they certainly weren't interested in their archives. Now, this has changed in the last 10 years. Greece now houses a number of very distinguished departments of Ottoman studies. We have the first dissertations. We certainly have at least 2 generations of Greek historians who can read Ottoman Turkish. We have Greek historians working in Turkish universities. And we have Turkish historians who read Greek and are working in Greek universities. And so the first works on this subject have appeared, and I found them incredibly illuminating. The first big collection of documents from the Ottoman archives on 1821 was published this year, little too late to be useful for me. This is going to be the major change in the next 10 years. We're going to really see this from the Ottoman perspective, and I think it's going to change many, many things. I was very aware when I was writing this book, I wanted to ask myself what the Ottoman policy was, how it had been reached, why the Ottoman logistical machine seized up in the way it did. What did they think about that? And I answered it as best as I could, because there are sources. But that whole side, it was like writing the history with one hand clapping, really. It's going to change a great deal in the next 10 to 15 years.
Really interesting. Thank you so much, Mark. Another question in our Q&A, anonymous attendee, but it's a great question. They write, old school diplomatic history may be dead, but isn't it also true that the rise of cultural history reflected a somewhat post-political mood a couple of decades ago? Today, aren't we back in the thick of great power history, understanding that it really does matter what people with decision-making authority in economics, politics and war are doing? Wouldn't you foresee a return of diplomatic history after an era of disdain?
Well, as I tried to say in this talk, what I ended up feeling was that you couldn't tell this story without both. You couldn't tell this story unless you explained why the great powers had initially opposed intervention and came round to intervention, because that was the decisive factor. But you couldn't explain why they came round to intervention unless you were attentive to the social history of the conflict and the cultural history of public opinion and European culture. And so I agree with the questioner that I think you can't behave as though these questions of great power politics are anything but of the first importance. It's how you frame them and how you analyze them that really counts. And do you see them a little from outside in terms of cultural expressions of their own?
Brilliant, thank you. We've got one more question. I'm just going to sneak in one more before we get to that as well, which is a kind of about the, there's a lot of these questions have been about how do we write this kind of history with the language problems and the archive problems and the creation of the archives. And I'm just wondering, I'm very struck by the fact that you said in the final analysis, you ended up using a lot of digital sources. And that's fantastic, obviously, when you're in the middle of a pandemic and you can't travel. It's wonderful that these digital archives are made available. Just wonder if you have any reflections about what has been digitized, maybe what wasn't digitized, what you couldn't see using that method, and how that has changed your your way into the topic and your your writing? Obviously, as a
Well,
development of your career
I was taken aback. I mean, working on Greece, I'm very sensitive to the fact that digitization proceeds unevenly across space. If you're an Americanist, possibly if you're a British historian, you have far greater resources available to you than if you're writing about a country that's peripheral to the digitization project. And I was taken aback at how much obscure 19th century material published in Athens or Alexandria or Odessa you could find online. It was an immense boon, I have to say. What is left out is an interesting question. I think right now what is lagging behind are local archives, local journals, not that those mattered very much in this particular case. I think one has to be sensitive to the question of what has not been digitized and how important that is. And I can see key areas of this history that we haven't touched, partly because the archives are difficult to get to.
I mean, it's just a kind of a reiteration of the problem of what goes into the archive in the first instance, which is already obviously not a neutral process, and it's just another layer on that, isn't it? It's fundamentally different. Okay, one final quick question before we close. It's from Bülent Basra. I can't pronounce Turkish and I don't know how to pronounce your surname, I apologise. But just a quick question, I think, to go out. Once the 1821 revolution happened, they said how they solved the Turkish Ottoman minority from Greece after all they've been living in Greece for a long time. Was there any ethnic cleansing, and do you have more generally evidence of population exchange?
Yeah, this was an issue that was extremely important to me and interesting. And the Greeks essentially try to wipe out the Muslim population of the Peloponnese and the traces of the Muslim population of the Peloponnese in almost all areas. And we have some very important and very moving, some very horrifying and some very moving accounts in Greek of this process. We also have a fascinating case of a popular prophet who appears in the mountains 5 years later when the Egyptians come, and he's saying to the Greeks that you've let yourself down by enslaving Muslims and treating them like they treated you. So this was being discussed at the time, and then it becomes, yes, the whole question enters the diplomacy after 1829, 1830. There isn't a population exchange, but there's a treatment of the question of Ottoman property. And then there are other associated questions because some Muslims convert to Christianity in an effort to stay, or they marry in an effort to stay. So the questioner is absolutely right that this very interconnected society leaves behind issues for the diplomats to tackle in the decades that follow.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much. I'm going to wrap up our lecture now. We've been going for quite a while. We are extremely grateful. I know it's a bit of a cliche, but I think it really is the case that the range of questions that we've had is really testimony to how you've brought something I know a lot of us don't know a great deal about, how you've really brought it alive for a kind of a British audience, and we're very grateful indeed. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Before we go, I will just close by reminding, well, apologies to our audience who's had any technical problems, and a reminder that our next lecture is on Friday, the 4th of February at 6 p.m. Andrew Jatiski at the Royal Holloway University of London will be speaking on monks and the Muslim enemy, conversion, polemic and resistance in monastic hagiography in the age of the Crusades. It will be an online lecture. But for those of you who are interested, we are very much planning now to get back to doing some in-person lectures. So I hope to be seeing some of you and meeting you in person as well soon. But for now, just thank you once again, Mark, for coming and speaking to us. And thank you very much for the audience for coming and listening as well. Good evening.